The only difficulty in the protagonist's life right now was finding a place to live. He was just a student, and there were only a few days left until the start of the academic year. His friends tried to cheer him up, but only worsened the situation. Suddenly, Taejoon's phone rang. It was Sunbae. The guys were so thrilled for their friend that they couldn't hide their admiration. Yet, Taejoon himself was haunted by the feeling that something was missing. An unsettling feeling, as if he had lost part of himself somewhere, and a scar he couldn't remember getting. The protagonist had no memories of his youth. Taejoon had a fear of the dark that he couldn't explain, along with auditory and visual hallucinations. All of these things could have been connected to his lost memories. Amidst all his worries, he hadn't noticed how he ended up near a private house. The owner stood by the open window, smoking a cigarette, when he suddenly noticed a man who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Recognizing him as his childhood friend, he called out his name. Taejoon stared at the blonde in astonishment, clearly intrigued by what was happening. Dropping everything, he dashed down the stairs and then ran outside. He ran headlong into the protagonist, squeezing him in a tight embrace. The blonde, beaming with a satisfied smile, admitted that he had missed him. Taejoon had no idea who stood before him, silently listening to everything he said. The stranger introduced himself as Yeon-woo, though he was surprised by the question of who he was. Yet this meant nothing to the protagonist. Reaching out his hand, Yeon-woo showed the boy a scar on his arm, which was identical to Taejoon's. Not believing his eyes, Taejoon asked the blonde to tell him about his past. But Yeon-woo wasn't ready to hear such a request, and silently stared at his old friend. The protagonist wouldn't relent, asking him to wait a little longer. He called his friends and told them that something urgent had come up, and they didn't have to wait for him. All the while, Yeon-woo silently watched the protagonist's back, pondering what had happened. To dispel his suspicions, he asked once more, this time more bluntly, if it was true that Taejoon remembered nothing. Turning to look at the blonde, the boy couldn't find the words to answer. He couldn't understand why Yeon-woo's mood had changed so drastically. The homeowner told Taejoon to get out, arguing that he was no longer the person he once knew. And without waiting for a response, he turned and went back inside. Watching Yeon-woo's retreating back, the boy grew anxious. He couldn't remember him, but for some reason he didn't like that fact. Reaching out his hand, the protagonist made a silent gesture to stop the blonde. Suddenly, Yeon-woo turned, looking back at him over his shoulder. Before he knew it, Taejoon had grabbed the edge of the other's clothing, feeling even more awkward. The first thing he could do in that situation was to ask if the homeowner had a vacant room. And how fortuitous it was. There was indeed one, though Taejoon himself didn't fully understand why he had said that. Yeon-woo, working on his laptop, asked his new roommate to keep it down, and the protagonist had no choice but to hold his tongue. Once, Taejoon had known him, but now the blonde was a stranger to him. Though they were best friends in childhood, he gave him a room, and now they could share the rent. One look at Yeon-woo, and the boy still felt the oppressive atmosphere, frustrated that he couldn't remember him. As he continued to carry boxes into his new room, the protagonist couldn't shake his thoughts. But all he truly wanted was for his new roommate to tell him about his past. After bringing in the last box, Taejoon took a short break when suddenly his attention was drawn to a black door directly opposite the room he was in. His curiosity was stronger, so he decided to check out what was hidden behind it himself. In the hallway hung a mirror, whose reflection Taejoon chose to ignore, or maybe he simply didn't notice how his reflection smirked smugly. Pausing beside the door, he hesitated a little, gripped by a slight fear, but overcoming it, he reached his hand toward the handle, but didn't even manage to touch it. Suddenly, there was a loud stomp, and Taejoon flinched, deciding it was not the best time to trust his curiosity. It was better to ask the homeowner himself, which he did the next moment, going down to Yeon-woo and inquiring about what was in the room opposite his. The blonde cast a skeptical glance at the boy, hesitating slightly before answering, but finally conceding. The dark room. Taejoon didn't quite understand what he meant, so Yeon-woo suggested he check for himself, then return to his work. Suddenly, a friend of the protagonist appeared around the corner, exclaiming with enthusiasm that Yeon-woo had a great house and that he wanted to be friends with him. The other two boys had to drag their shouting friend away and cover his mouth, apologizing to the blonde for the noise. But Yeon-woo wasn't angry at all, saying that everything was fine. As he put it, if it gets quiet, it means these three are stealing something. For a moment, an awkward silence hung in the air, after which the friends erupted in new protests, and Taejoon had to drag both of them away from the busy man. When the work was done and deep night had fallen, Yeon-woo sat in bed reading a book before sleep. He was interrupted by a knock at the door, and then Taejoon peered out from behind it. As it turned out, the protagonist didn't have a blanket, which would only arrive the next day, so he decided to ask the blonde for one. The silence that hung in the air made the protagonist uneasy, and he thought he'd have to sleep without a blanket tonight. Suddenly, Yeon-woo suggested he lie down beside him since his bed was large, and he didn't have a spare blanket. Taejoon grew noticeably nervous, not quite understanding the proposal, and the blonde calmly explained that they used to do this often as children, so there was nothing new about it. In the end, the boy had no choice but to obey and lie down with his old childhood friend in the same bed. Silently observing everything around him, the protagonist suddenly realized that this room looked familiar. Too familiar. Especially the window. Yeon-woo, as if reading his mind, said they often used to climb through that window, scaling the tree. Taejoon was only disconcerted by the clarification that they did it together. He suddenly sprang up, asking in surprise if they had lived here. The blonde calmly explained that he had lived there with his parents, while his friend had lived in an orphanage nearby, which was now no longer functioning. Listening to all this, the protagonist wanted as many details and stories as possible, so he made a face that was sure to work. But it was in vain. Yeon-woo grew visibly angry, once again asking if he really remembered nothing at all. With a distinctive snap, he closed the book and declared that he would consider the offer. But for now, he just wanted to sleep. As he lay down, the blonde wanted to turn off the light, but Taejoon stopped him, asking him not to. When asked why, the protagonist faltered and then said he simply couldn't fall asleep if the room was too dark. But Yeon-woo couldn't sleep if the room was too bright, so, ignoring Taejoon's protests, he switched off the light. To calm the trembling body beside him, the blonde grabbed the boy's hand, explaining that in childhood, when he was scared, Taejoon would hold his hand. Initially, Yeon-woo seemed gloomy to the protagonist, but now he behaved like a good person. So, without much thought, the boy lay down beside the blonde, squeezing his hand in return. He truly wanted to remember who he was. Taejoon managed to fall asleep only for a short while. He tossed and turned in his sleep and soon opened his eyes. The slightly open door to the room suddenly slammed shut, catching the boy's attention and scaring him out of his wits. However, that wasn't the end. The door creaked open again, and a terrified Taejoon turned on his side. He tried to wake the sleeping Yeon-woo beside him, but he didn't respond. In the window's reflection, the protagonist saw a figure approach the bed, stand beside him, and then lean closer. Suddenly, the dark figure smiled, welcoming Taejoon back. The door slammed loudly again, and the boy jumped up in bed, sitting up straight. As it turned out, it was all just a nightmare, after which the protagonist tried to catch his breath, still holding Yeon-woo's hand. A little while later, it dawned on him, and Taejoon quickly pulled his hand back, forgetting that the blonde had taken his hand first. It was already morning outside, so the protagonist wasted no time. Leaving the room and getting dressed, he went for a run. Then the boy had a quick bite to eat and took a shower, after which he put himself in order and dressed in the appropriate uniform. Yeon-woo was still asleep, and Taejoon, seeing this, decided not to wake him. Quietly bidding farewell, he closed the door and finally left. On his way to the academy, his friends called out to him, naming him the best of the enrolled students of the 67th Police Department. One of the boys showered his friend with compliments, while the other asked him to keep quiet. Soon, all three went to class, which consisted of several lectures and taekwondo. The martial arts instructor was thrilled with Taejoon and openly praised him. And rightly so. The protagonist demonstrated exceptional taekwondo skills that were nothing short of enviable. After class, the boy spoke with the instructor one-on-one, admitting that he felt uncomfortable with the man's overt favoritism. But as it turned out, the instructor was happy to do so, as he was proud that Taejoon had followed in his footsteps to join the police force. When Taejoon mentioned that he remembered the orphanage in the area where he grew up, the man jumped up, unable to believe his ears. The instructor was Taejoon's guardian and was overjoyed that the boy he had raised had finally recovered at least some memories. The man declared that the boy would always be a welcome guest in their home, so he asked him not to put undue pressure on himself. The protagonist smiled broadly, saying he didn't, and was immensely grateful for the man's upbringing, but could no longer continue to accept his help. From the subsequent conversation, Taejoon learned that Sunbae's family had gone missing, but the guardian wasn't willing to go into detail, changing the subject to the boy being late for class. Returning home in the evening, Taejoon reflected that the guardian must be deeply saddened by the disappearance of his close friend. He even wondered if he should stay with him, but quickly talked himself out of it. The man was the kind whose pride would be hurt by such a gesture. Entering the yard, the boy heard the sound of a basketball being dribbled around the corner. Suddenly, the ball flew toward him, and fortunately, he caught it, his eyes wide with surprise. Yeon-woo, who called out to him, inviting him to play, looked more than determined to win. He was confident Taejoon wouldn't refuse him. And so it happened. The boy didn't refuse, and soon the basketball game was in full swing. Both boys were tied, each fully focused on winning, occasionally glancing at each other. In the end, as predicted, Yeon-woo won, while Taejoon collapsed onto the grass, exhausted, still unable to believe his defeat, as he had never lost a one-on-one game before. The blonde then recalled how, in childhood, his friend would complain after every loss and swear he'd never play basketball again. Taejoon asked with undisguised interest if it was true that they used to play basketball as children, to which Yeon-woo reacted less than positively. He irritably asked if the boy had really just forgotten everything, or if he had changed. Extending his hand to Taejoon, the blonde urged him to hurry up and remember everything, as it was bewildering. The protagonist once again urged the boy to simply tell him everything, but Yeon-woo deftly changed the subject, saying that he was hot after the game and wanted to take a shower. Unabashedly, the blonde pulled off his t-shirt, baring his back, at which Taejoon stared with slight embarrassment. Yeon-woo noticed the other's gaze when he turned around, but said nothing about it, only asking the boy to take his clothes to the dry cleaner as well. Unexpectedly, he stepped closer to Taejoon, extending his hands to the boy's shirt and starting to unbutton it. The surprise on Taejoon's face was unmistakable. He wasn't thrilled with such manipulations, but he didn't dare take action. Taejoon's heart betrayed him, pounding several times faster, and Yeon-woo could clearly feel it. But he continued his task silently, while the protagonist nervously gulped. Suddenly, Taejoon took control of himself, deciding to end what was happening by grabbing the edges of his shirt and pushing the blonde away. Yeon-woo merely glanced at him, then bent down for the ball, casually remarking how he didn't like that the boy was studying at the police academy. However, as he left, he couldn't help but note how great Taejoon looked in their uniform. Heading back into the house, the blonde left the boy alone, and finally, the protagonist could unleash his emotions, blushing to the tips of his ears. A little while later, while showering, Taejoon stood under the stream of water, intently examining his reflection in the mirror. Raising his hand, he ran his palm over the spots on his chest where Yeon-woo had touched his skin. Embarrassed once more, the boy pulled his hand back and leaned his forehead against the mirror, still processing what had happened. He must have lost his mind to start thinking about such perversions, but their touches were barely more than that, so it didn't carry any real context. Taejoon loved his healthy body, so he resolutely told himself that from tomorrow he would run twice the distance. Waking up in the middle of the night again, the boy found that he couldn't even move. He felt, and then saw, his hands being touched by foreign, bloodied palms, after which the whole room was filled with an endless number of them, and his name echoed clearly in his mind. This terrifying dream no longer seemed so frightening when the hands began to slide over his body with pleasant sensations. Taejoon couldn't resist due to his paralysis, so he had to endure and enjoy what was given. The boy hears Yeon-woo's voice, and he feels like he's hallucinating when suddenly two strong hands grip his neck with all their might, forcing his eyes wide open. They're choking him, and he tries to at least twitch, but his entire body feels petrified, and tears stream from the corners of his eyes. Unexpectedly, Taejoon hears a crack, and immediately after he opens his eyes in the present moment, waking up in his bed. His hand instinctively reaches for his neck, checking it, and what a relief washes over him when everything is fine. It was just another nightmare. The protagonist's morning routine remains the same: a run, a shower, getting dressed, and heading to class. As always, Yeon-woo was still asleep this time, so the boy decided not to wake him. Before leaving, Taejoon is drawn by the noise coming from the room with the black door. That room calls and beckons to him again, and the protagonist reaches for the handle, already imagining himself opening it. But he quickly pulls back, spinning on his heels. He's running late, after all. The reflection in the mirror hanging in the hallway suddenly speaks. Taejoon smiles in it, asking him to open the door. The real Taejoon pulls his hat down over his eyes, telling himself to ignore everything since it's just a hallucination. The voices and reflections wouldn't relent, multiplying, and the boy muttered to himself in annoyance that there were too many mirrors in this house. Descending the stairs, the steps creaking beneath his feet, Taejoon finds Yeon-woo asleep at his desk. The blonde was gently snoring, his cheek resting on his palm. The protagonist noted a few details. He had stayed up late and had been drinking. Such a lifestyle didn't particularly impress the boy, so he stepped closer, feigning indignation as he scolded the homeowner for his actions. Yeon-woo merely grumbled in discontent, and Taejoon, in turn, took a blanket and draped it over his shoulders, giving the blonde a slight pat on the head. If only he knew what it would lead to, he would never have done it. As soon as he touched his hair, an image flashed in his mind of Yeon-woo stroking his body. Startled and frightened, Taejoon jerked back, then blushed with embarrassment. Deciding he shouldn't linger any longer, the boy raced to college, berating himself for losing his mind entirely. Sitting in a lecture, he repeated the same phrase like a mantra, trying not to think of Yeon-woo. While his friends next to him were gossiping and chatting about various things, Taejoon had no choice but to bury his face in his notebook. Suddenly, a conversation started among the guys about who the boy's parents were, and whispers spread throughout the room, but he just ignored them. However, the reflection in the window wasn't willing to endure it so easily, egging on the protagonist and asking if he needed help. Lately, the hallucinations had become more intense, but Taejoon continued to pointedly ignore them. Deciding to explain the situation to the guys, he told them that he was lucky to be accepted into this class, but he believed it was the result of his own efforts. The best solution now was to change the topic, which the boy did, noting that his friend had been reading a lot lately. He asked what he was reading, and the friend mentioned an author's name from America. Upon hearing it, one of the female classmates also joined the discussion. In all of this, it turned out that the author's name and Yeon-woo's name were the same, and he was also the author of the book. After class, the group headed to the cafeteria, where they continued their lively discussion while enjoying the local food. Only Taejoon remained composed. He knew Yeon-woo was a writer, but hadn't thought he was so popular. One of the boys suddenly jumped up, slapping his palms on the table and proposing they go ask him about it in person. Half the group sprang to their feet, intent on carrying out their plan, while the protagonist hesitated for a moment, deciding to call and warn Yeon-woo about the sudden visit. However, Taejoon couldn't do so, as his phone was left in the room while its owner smoked on the porch. Meanwhile, the guys were already on their way, drunkenly discussing things that couldn't possibly be true. Taejoon knew his roommate wouldn't tolerate such a circus, so he outran the guys and arrived at the yard first, meeting a smoking Yeon-woo. He apologized immediately but couldn't explain anything, as the group entered the yard right behind him, filling it with their presence. The protagonist hunched his head into his shoulders guiltily, but the homeowner just continued to stare down the newcomers while finishing his cigarette. One of the guys, the one who had suggested they all crash Yeon-woo's place, stepped forward and rudely addressed the boy, pointing at him. When asked if he was the author of the book, the blonde calmly answered that he was. The unmistakable shock on the faces of those around showed that they hadn't believed it could possibly be true. But the boy who had asked the question couldn't let it go, calling it a lie. He climbed onto the porch and demanded that Yeon-woo show him his studio. Instead, the blonde stubbed his cigarette on the other's forehead without uttering a word. The boy froze in horror, and only after a few seconds did he flinch, screaming from the searing pain. Taejoon, of course, condemned the act and even called out to his friend, but it was in vain. Yeon-woo looked too menacing, and the voice with which he ordered them to get lost sent chills down everyone's spine. Suddenly, to everyone's surprise, the house trembled slightly. The first to notice was a girl who took a few steps back. Others also saw the floor shaking, which frightened and unnerved them as they glanced around. But Taejoon appeared calm because he understood what had caused the trembling, the numerous mirrors in the house. The boy and the homeowner exchanged glances, and the former, unable to bear it, fled. He ordered the others to leave immediately, all because Yeon-woo's gaze seemed too deranged to him. Returning to the house, the blonde calmly resumed working on his book as if nothing had happened. After seeing his friends off, Taejoon also returned home, entering the living room where Yeon-woo sat, apologizing for what had just transpired. But the blonde didn't understand what he was apologizing for and asked a corresponding question. As it turned out, the protagonist had also apologized to his friends, which didn't impress Yeon-woo. He reproached his roommate, saying that they had tried to barge into their house, and Taejoon didn't have the guts to stop them. The boy remained silent, unable to answer Yeon-woo's questions. Suddenly, Yeon-woo called him a sweet and good person. He asked if Taejoon truly felt comfortable living there, leaving the boy stunned. And once again, receiving no response, Yeon-woo stood up from his desk and headed for his room, passing by the silent boy who hung his head guiltily. Left alone with his thoughts, Taejoon stood in the room for a while longer, pondering all the words his roommate had said. Routine life, proper behavior, a model student. He must make a good impression to feel better about himself. The boy felt as if a piece of him had been torn out, leaving a void that he tried to fill with people. For Taejoon, it was genuinely terrifying. The fear of loss and the fear of loneliness. Sitting in yet another class, he noticed his reflection in the window, asking if a bunch of losers nearby would truly help him overcome his loneliness. Despite having many friends in college, the protagonist still felt out of place. Suddenly, one of his friends, who had fallen victim to Yeon-woo yesterday, asked if he remained indifferent even after what happened. In truth, Taejoon found it cool but only told his friend to calm down, saying they'd hang out another time. Leaving the classroom, he headed to the bathroom and stood before the mirror. Taejoon wrapped his hands around his neck, trying to squeeze it as Yeon-woo had, but he simply couldn't do it. Still clutching his neck, the boy noticed his reflection smirking. It asked if it was true that Taejoon felt better only after indulging in such behavior. Unable to withstand the pressure, the boy quickly unclasped his fingers and released his neck, leaning over the sink and trying to catch his breath. He needed to stop relieving stress this way, but it was like an addiction that wasn't easy to break. After classes, Taejoon decided to drop by a bookstore where he found the very book written by his roommate. Taking it in his hands, he quickly decided to buy and read it, if only to get a glimpse of Yeonwoo's interests. On his way home, the protagonist thought about yesterday's conversation and the look the blonde had given him. It was full of contempt. Winding himself up to the point where thoughts of eviction crept into his mind, Taejoon became visibly upset, hesitating to enter the house. He enjoyed living with Yeonwoo, but it seemed the blonde was just becoming more disappointed with each passing day. Pulling himself together, he stepped inside, finding his roommate still hard at work on his new book. Taejoon greeted him, but there was no response, making him feel awkward again. Deciding not to leave it at that, the boy asked if he'd had dinner. The answer was no, and Taejoon also noticed that there were many more bottles of strong liquor around. Without hesitation, he offered to make dinner, to which Yeonwoo glanced only out of the corner of his eye but gave no answer, though at least he didn't refuse. Soon, a salad with chicken breast appeared on the table, which didn't impress the homeowner but instead left him in indescribable shock. He couldn't understand how anyone could get full on such food, to which Taejoon began to defend himself, saying it was his main dish and was healthy. Unable to take it anymore, Yeonwoo abruptly stood up and began preparing dinner himself. His dish was rice with shrimp and oysters, beautifully arranged in a deep, long bowl. Taejoon was delighted by the aroma and appearance, and Yeonwoo declared that humans are born to enjoy good food. Seeing the boy's bewildered expression, the blonde chided him and then offered him a spoonful of food, which Taejoon accepted eagerly. Dinner continued on a more pleasant note, and after some time, Yeonwoo noticed that Taejoon had bought his book. The protagonist confessed that he was simply curious, but wasn't allowed to finish. The author interrupted, saying that Taejoon could have just taken one of the books from his study. But what was done, so he asked Taejoon for a pen and the book he'd bought to leave an autograph. It also turned out that Yeonwoo became popular for one reason only. He wanted to see the boy, so he became famous. Yeonwoo wanted his name to reach the other's ears on its own. Such an admission surprised Taejoon, but what surprised him even more was that he himself was the prototype for the protagonist in the book. Unable to find the right words, he scratched his head awkwardly and thanked his friend for the gesture. Taejoon realized that Yeonwoo had started writing because of him, and even made him the prototype of the book's protagonist. It was like saying, "I lived thinking of you," which was all the more astonishing. Yeonwoo couldn't stay angry with the boy for long, as he admitted, and then stared at him as if he were a painting. Taejoon felt uncomfortable, so he hurriedly covered his face with the book, hiding his blushing cheeks behind it. Jumping up, he grabbed all his things and rushed off, not forgetting to wish Yeonwoo a good night, while the blonde just looked after him, smiling contentedly. Once in his room, Taejoon slid down the door to the floor and clutched his head, trying to understand what had just happened. Perhaps Yeonwoo was misleading him after all. He was a writer, and his way of expressing himself might be a bit different from what everyone was used to. Changing into pajamas, the boy sat on the edge of the bed, taking the book with him. He couldn't wait to find out its genre, but as soon as he realized it was a horror thriller, the realization hit him. That night, Taejoon had another dream, though it wasn't exactly a nightmare. The bloodied hands were caressing him again, and Yeonwoo's voice whispered in his ear. The blonde murmured that he would bring him pleasure, and the protagonist could do nothing but resign himself to his fate. In the morning, he woke up in the same position he had been left in during the dream, lying on his stomach under the blanket. But this time, Taejoon was even disappointed that everything had only been a dream, a figment of his imagination. Yeonwoo watched through the partially open door, observing what his roommate was doing. And Taejoon had no idea that the blonde could see everything he was up to at that moment. Taejoon moaned his name, but the boy only stood humbly outside and kept watching. It's not time yet. During today's run, Taejoon pushed himself to the limit, all to forget what had happened in the morning. He was ashamed of thinking about his friend in such a way. Entering the house, he ran into Yeonwoo and was startled, even though he had only asked one question. Stammering, Taejoon tried to answer when something suddenly crashed into his leg, scaring him once more. That something turned out to be a robot vacuum cleaner to which Yeonwoo had even given a name. The blonde spoke to the robot as if it were a person, which greatly amused Taejoon. However, the seriousness and clarification from the homeowner about what the boy had meant made him flinch in fear again. It turned out that Yeonwoo had finished with his manuscripts and decided to do some cleaning and laundry, so he immediately instructed Taejoon to put his dirty clothes in the washing machine. First went the blanket, which the boys then shook out together before hanging it up to dry. Working together brought them closer, and it was evident to the naked eye. Suddenly, a memory washed over Taejoon, where he, as a little boy, was running across the yard. The boy stopped at the door, calling for his friend to come out and play, but got no response. So, coming up with a better solution, he went to the tree and climbed up. Snapping out of it, the present-day Taejoon took off running towards the tree he had just seen in his memory. The boy climbed up it without hesitation, like a monkey, while Yeon-woo watched in astonishment, not understanding what was happening. Reaching the top, Taejoon looks at the window and stretches out his hand when memories suddenly overwhelm him again. A younger version of himself climbs into the room through the window, addressing a young Yeon-woo. The boy invites him to play outside, but his friend refuses, busy with homework that never seems to end. The adult Taejoon also climbs through the window, finding himself inside. He looks around, noting how much has changed. Yeon-woo didn't waste time. Instead of using the stairs, he followed Taejoon, asking if he had remembered anything. Pointing to the right side of the room, Taejoon recalls how a desk used to stand there. Quickly picking up his pace and opening the door, he walks a little farther, opening another door to reveal Yeon-woo's parents' room. And across from their room is the one with the black door, which must not be opened. Reaching out for the handle, Taejoon remembers little Yeon-woo grabbing his wrist, stopping him, and ordering him never to open it. The only reason given was that it was scary, and that was enough to frighten young Taejoon. When the memories ended, the present-day Yeon-woo asked if his friend remembered anything else, but unfortunately, that was all. The blonde chuckled softly, saying that Taejoon fears that room but doesn't lock his own door at night. The boy looked up in surprise, suddenly realizing that Yeon-woo had seen everything that morning. And the proof was his smile, along with the words that Taejoon hadn't seemed scared at all this morning.